Welcome to the podcast, Amazing Tales from Off and On Connecticut's Beaten Path, and I'm your host, Mike Allen. The Sea Surveyor was the name of a ship, a military research vehicle, back in the 1960s. It had 75 successful missions out at sea. It was based out of the Electric Boat Shipyard in Groton. Well, its 76th mission was to be its last. It sank with 12 men on board. Today we bring to the program Walter Wally Banzhaf. He was one of the 12 men on that Sea Surveyor ship, and he survived. He's here to tell his story from that gripping event 50 years ago in the first of a two-part series. Wally, as he prefers to be called, will be along in just a moment. Amazing Tales from Off and On Connecticut's Beaten Path is brought to you by our sponsor, Yale New Haven Health. When people need the best quality health care, there's a reason they turn to Yale New Haven Health. In 1826, Yale New Haven Hospital became Connecticut's very first hospital. They were the first hospital in the U.S. to use chemotherapy. Yale New Haven was the first to introduce insulin pumps for diabetic patients, and they introduced the world's first intensive care unit for newborns. For more information about Yale New Haven Health, visit ynhhs.org. That's ynhhs.org. It was early in the calendar year of 1969. In fact, just 5 days into that new year. It was a cold and frosty day on the Thames River in eastern Connecticut. It's where both Groton and New London are located on the banks of the river, one on each side, as that river enters Long Island Sound. The story you're about to hear over the next two episodes is frankly a little bit hard to fathom. It's a survivor's tale of when our guest and 11 of his colleagues saw their boat sink hundreds of miles off Nantucket Island in the high seas of the Atlantic Ocean during a ferocious storm in the middle of winter. Now, the basic gist of the story, and you'll hear more about it, is that they were on a secret military mission on behalf of the U.S. Navy's nuclear sub-base in Groton, with representatives of two different organizations on board to conduct certain tests. Well, the boat they were riding in was a former ferry boat. It was big, 120 feet long, weighed 290 tons, and for most of its life it had shuttled cars across the St. Lawrence Seaway, in fact for the first 30 years of its life, and it was primarily designed for use on that river. Electric Boat is the firm that makes the bulk of the Navy's nuclear submarines in Groton. Now, they purchased the ship in 1965 and renamed it the Sea Surveyor. They remodeled it, stripped it down, turned it into a research vessel to meet their needs. Walter Banzhaf, who prefers to go by his nickname Wally, was one of the 12 men on board that ship when it took off. He spent the bulk of his life after the event you're going to hear over the next two episodes, nearly 3 decades, teaching as a professor at the University of Hartford in multiple fields surrounding the general field of electronic engineering technology. But back in 1969, he was just 22 years old, and that made him the youngest of the dozen men on the Sea Surveyor. Well, Wally, like any great story like this, let's start at the beginning. And you have a boat that dated back to 1939, so it was at that point a 30-year-old boat, which Electric Boat had bought, I guess, 4 years before you went out on this fateful trip. And it had done 75 missions out in the water. This was the 76th mission in which it would sink. And my first question to you is, how familiar were you with this boat? Had you ever been out on a mission, or was this your first time on the Sea Surveyor?
Absolutely my first time. The Sea Surveyor research vessel belonged to Electric Boat Division of General Dynamics, and they used the Sea Surveyor for mostly recording sound of mostly submarines. The Navy is very, very interested in having submarines be as quiet as possible and recording using hydrophones when a submarine passes by at different depths, at different speeds. That's vital information for helping a submarine stay covert and undiscovered underwater.
So now here you are, it's 1969, Vietnam War is raging, you're doing this really a military mission, a classified military mission. And for people who are not familiar with Southeast Connecticut and the lay of the land there, just a quick second on this. So you have the Thames River that goes up in between New London and Groton. And on the east side is where Electric Boat Shipyard is. This is where the nuclear sub base is, and this is where the nuclear submarines are built. And on the west side is New London, and that's where Fort Trumbull is. And correct me if I'm wrong, but that's where you were based at something called the Navy Underwater Sound Laboratory. What did you do there?
I was hired to be a RF, radio frequency engineer, working on nothing whatsoever to do with sound. It had to do with electromagnetic waves. It's very, very important that a submarine be able to communicate both directions. It should be able to receive messages and it should be able to send messages, and also has to do calibration so it knows exactly where it is at all times. So my thing was RF, radio frequency antennas of many, many different types for a wide range of frequencies.
Now, there were going to be 12 people on board this ship, and it was designed for maybe a few more than that, but you had 12, 7 crew members, you had 5 observers from Electric Boat, and then you and a colleague from the Underwater Sound Lab. And the mission was to go essentially 275 miles south of Nantucket, rendezvous with an underwater nuclear sub, and conduct these tests so to make sure that their antenna on the sub was working and all the things you've discussed. And so this is fine, and you're doing this now right after New Year's in 1969. It's January 5th. It's so cold that there's ice on the Thames River that you had to break through to get into Long Island Sound. Tell us what it was like. As I understand it, the further south you went away from Long Island Sound and out into the Atlantic, the seas got rougher.
Yeah, the ice was very, very thin. It didn't really impede. I mean, one could have canoed through this thickness of ice, but you would have heard some crackling sounds. So as we left New London Harbor, we got out into more deeper water, more active water with wind and waves, and there was no more ice. But it was wicked cold. I don't remember the temperature, but perhaps 12 or 15 degrees Fahrenheit. And then we steamed south, heading for our rendezvous with the nuclear submarine, the Greenling, USS Greenling, which was a nuclear attack submarine. And our job was to meet up with it and then to have it kind of park and just be stationary. And then the Sea Surveyor was going to make circles around the submarine while it was stationary. And they would be trying to make sure that at all bearings, whether it was straight ahead, 0 degrees, 90 degrees, 180 degrees, 270 degrees, at all different positions of the Sea Surveyor, the radio signals would be received and instantaneously turned into information that the captain of the submarine would be really interested in, like what type of signal, which country would be sending such a signal. Was it radar? Was it communications? Telemetry, that kind of thing.
So you had all sorts of sophisticated equipment on board this boat, the Sea Surveyor, and you were heading toward the rendezvous, and it was nighttime, and people were asleep on the boat, and it was a little bit before midnight, I guess, probably about 20 minutes before 12, when you got woken up. Would you explain what happened?
Yeah, I was violently seasick. I had never really been out on the ocean ever. I learned very quickly about seasickness. My body explained it to me very, very eloquently. So I was kind of hiding in bed all day, wishing my head didn't hurt. I was awakened by a loud crashing sound. My back was against the wall. In other words, the ship was listing steadily to port so that the floor wasn't level anymore. And that's why my back was against the wall. I hopped out of bed, put on some shoes. I went right into the laboratory space where all our transmitting equipment was stored. It was going to be used hopefully the following day. I discovered water sloshing around on the floor of the laboratory. Sensing this was not a good thing or a normal thing, I grabbed all of the manuals. The equipment was much too heavy for one person to move, but I grabbed all the operating manuals, which had the information about how to set the frequencies, the power levels, type of modulation, and so on. I brought it to my cabin for safekeeping. Little did I know that an hour later, my cabin would be heading down to 12,000 feet below the surface.
Now, just so that people who are like me, a little bit like landlubbers and not very familiar with the wording of a boat, so port side and starboard side and all this, if you're looking at the front of the boat, the bow of the boat, on the left is the port side and on the right is the starboard side. And what the boat was doing at this point in time was the left side of the boat was tipping so far toward the water that it was about 4 feet away from the edge of the water, and waves were lapping up onto the surface of the boat. And the right side of the boat was sticking up in the air. And so you hear, I guess, 12 bells. What did that mean?
I didn't know what 12 bells meant. There was mounted on the wall of each of the private staterooms that people could rent when it was a ferry back in 1939, a bell chart. And the bell chart would tell you what 4 bells, 8 bells, and so on meant, having to do with crew changes. That's mostly how they communicate time to change crew. And I look and I saw 12 bells and it said abandoned ship. Well, that's got to be an error, I thought to myself. That can't be. I mean, this is our ship. We're out in the middle of the ocean. And then there were 12 blasts on the air horn, the foghorn of the Sea Surveyor, which you would use in bad weather or at night when other ships were around. And then a man was running up and down the corridor outside all the staterooms saying, put on your life jackets, come forward to the port side, the left side, and get in the life raft. And that's when it kind of hit me that this was real.
Now, we're going to go back to this gentleman, Adrian Lane, a little bit later. He was the captain of the ship, and he had incredible credentials. He was also from Connecticut, as you were, from Noank, and he had worked on the sea in projects like this for years and years. So he knew what he was doing, and to abandon ship obviously was going to be quite serious. But like anybody else, he was the last to get off the ship. Like any other captain, he was the last to get off the ship. And explain what this is like, because now here's the boat listing to the left. The rubber raft, it's a large raft. It would hold, more than your 12 men, but it was large. But still, you had to jump those last 4 feet into the rubber raft, which was bouncing around on the water. What was that like?
It was not very hard to get off the sinking ship. I had a huge motivation to do that. And it was the raft was tethered to the railing. Now, normally this railing would have been 12 feet up in the air above the water when the ship was level, when the ship was not listing to port. However, it was very, very close. The railing was extremely close. So it wasn't a matter of jumping horizontally 4 feet, but rather jumping 4 feet down. And that made it kind of easy to do. Gravity helped you get into the life raft. Unfortunately, Captain Lane was the last off the ship. Just as he jumped, by a combination of wind and waves, he bounced off the life raft and landed in the water. So he was thoroughly soaked, not injured, I'm happy to say, but he got pulled in. 2 or 3 of us reached out and grabbed him by the coat and pulled him in.
One thing I'd like to just sort of clarify here, because I think it's one of the odd things about the ocean, is that while you say it was 12 degrees air temperature, the water was not as cold, was it?
Very correct. In fact, the air was not that cold out in the ocean. It was cold the night we left around midnight when we left New London, but as we steamed south, it was getting warmer. And we're not sure exactly. At times we were in the Gulf Stream, at other times we were not in the Gulf Stream. But the air was certainly in the, let's say, the 30s, perhaps upper 30s. The water was probably 10 degrees warmer than that.
So now the other thing is to put some time frame on this. So you were awakened in your cabin shortly before midnight on January 6th. The clock obviously turned to January 7th very rapidly after that. As you mentioned, the raft was tethered to the boat. You had to stop that from occurring. You had to cut away from the boat, didn't you? And just in time.
Yeah, the line that connects a raft to another ship or any two ships together is called a painter, like the word someone who would paint a picture. And the painter is very important to keep that life raft as close as possible. However, at the moment the last person got in, who was Captain Lane, his first command was quickly cut the painter. And someone took a knife and cut the painter because only a few minutes later the Sea Surveyor slipped below the waves. And had we not cut the painter, we all would have been dragged down with the ship as it sank.
Do you recall watching the ship go down? I read somewhere that lights were still visible under the water for a short period of time.
That is exactly correct. And I was quite mystified at that point because I'm an electrical engineer. And I knew that the lights were not battery operated. How could there possibly be electricity while the ship is 30, 40 feet underwater? All the navigation lights were on. There were lights out on the decks so people walking there could see what they were doing. Well, it turns out there is several generators, but the one that was important for this is it was inside a room where it had diesel fuel coming to it, and the room was full of air. And the generator was quite happy, even though the ship was 30, 40 feet underwater, providing electricity for the lights until it too flooded at some greater depth.
We're going to leave it here for this episode, understanding that the very first question when we return at next week's episode is what happened to the 12 men as they rode those 25-foot waves in gale force winds out in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. That wraps up this episode of Amazing Tales from Off and On Connecticut's Beaten Path. I want to thank our guest for today's program, Walter Wally Banzhaf, who was one of the 12 members on board the ill-fated Sea Surveyor that sank in the Atlantic Ocean 50 years ago. Luckily, he survived to go on to become a University of Hartford professor of electronic engineering technology. Next week on Amazing Tales CT, we're going to pick up with Wally and conclude the story of the incredible sinking of the Sea Surveyor. Amazing Tales from Off and On Connecticut's Beaten Path is a production of True North Associates, LLC. This is Mike Allen. Be safe and stay healthy.